Most fortunes do not outlive the person who built them. Within 2 generations, most of them are gone, spent, split apart, or simply lost to a decision nobody thought to make while there was still time. And yet, a small number of families quietly did something almost nobody talks about. They didn't just get rich. They built something around the money that kept working long after they were gone, long after their children were gone, long after anyone alive could still remember their name. It was never really about how much they had. Every family that has ever gone broke was, at some point, unbelievably wealthy. It was about what they built around the money once they had it. The rules, the trusts, the boards, the marriages, the quiet decisions written into documents nobody outside the family will ever read. Tonight isn't about how old money thinks. Mindset changes with every generation, and it has never once, on its own, stopped a fortune from disappearing. Tonight is about the machinery. Families. 6 different mechanisms, each one tested by a real crisis, a real lawsuit, a real heir who nearly ended everything. Some of that machinery held. By the end, you'll understand exactly what keeps a fortune alive for 100 years, and it has almost nothing to do with what you've probably been told. In 1865, a 21-year-old named William Wallace Cargill bought a single grain warehouse in Conover, Iowa. He had no idea he was building what would eventually become one of the largest privately held companies on the planet. And he certainly had no idea that the hardest problem his family would ever solve wouldn't be how to grow the business. It would be how to keep more than 100 descendants from tearing it apart. The first real test came almost immediately. When W. Cargill died in 1909, the company was drowning in debt. It survived because of a marriage, not a business decision. 14 years earlier, his daughter Edna had married John H. McMillan Sr., and it was McMillan who stepped in, steadied the company, and steered it out of collapse. From that point forward, it wasn't really the Cargill Company anymore. It was the Cargill-McMillan Company, run by 2 intertwined family lines instead of one. That structure worked for decades, until it nearly didn't. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, Cargill kept missing its own sales targets, still recovering from a grain export embargo the United States had placed on the Soviet Union a decade earlier. At exactly the wrong moment, a new problem surfaced from inside the family itself. With each new generation, the ownership pie kept getting sliced into smaller pieces. A parent who once held a meaningful share of the company was now watching it split between 2, 3, sometimes 4 children, each entitled to their portion, and a growing number of them wanted more than a modest annual dividend. They wanted actual cash. It was exactly the kind of pressure that has quietly dissolved other family fortunes. Heirs, thinly connected to a business they never worked in, demanding liquidity a company can't easily provide without going public or selling to outsiders. Cargill did neither. In 1992, the company created an employee stock ownership plan, and the following year it used that structure to buy back roughly 17% of the company from 72 Cargill and McMillan family members for $730 million, with an outside trustee, State Street Bank, overseeing the transaction. Family members who wanted out could leave with real money. The company never had to answer to Wall Street to make it happen. At the same time, something quieter and more permanent was written directly into the company's own bylaws. Family representation on the board was capped at just 6 of 17 seats, split 4 for the McMillan line and 2 for the Cargill line, specifically so no single branch of the family could ever dominate the company's decisions on its own. By 1995, the family had gone even further, stepping back entirely from day-to-day executive roles. Whitney McMillan was the last family member to serve as chief executive. Every leader since has been a professional manager, hired for the job rather than born into it, while the family kept roughly 90% ownership sitting quietly behind the scenes. The family also built a private office of its own, called Waycross, established in 1991 for the sole purpose of managing Cargill and McMillan money. Investments, tax planning, succession, completely separate from the operating company itself. Written into the family's own agreements is a standing right of first refusal. Before any Cargill or McMillan descendant can sell their shares to an outsider, the family gets the first chance to buy them back. Ownership almost never leaves the bloodline, even when individual members do. None of this made headlines the way a scandal would have. It rarely does. By early 2024, Forbes estimated the Cargill-Macmillan family's combined net worth at $60.6 billion, spread across more than a dozen billionaires within a single extended family, the fourth richest family fortune in the United States, built almost entirely on a company that has never once sold a single share to the public. The Irving family has spent more than a century turning down almost every interview request that has ever reached them. There is no unauthorized biography of any real substance, no tell-all memoir, no televised profile with a single unguarded moment. And yet you can trace almost their entire modern strategy through one decision a single man made in 1971, a decision he never publicly explained. The story begins earlier, with a young man named James Durgavel Irving running a sawmill in Bouctouche, New Brunswick, starting in 1882. His son, Kenneth Colin Irving, known simply as KC, opened his first gas station in the same small town in 1924 after a larger oil company cut off his right to resell their fuel. He responded by importing gasoline himself. That instinct, refused to depend on anyone else in the chain, became the philosophy behind everything he built afterward. He expanded into forestry, pulp and paper, shipbuilding, transportation, and newspapers, eventually controlling more than a quarter of all the forested land in the entire province of New Brunswick, more than 3 million acres. Land, unlike a stock portfolio, cannot be sold with a single phone call in a moment of panic, and it cannot evaporate overnight the way a market crash can empty a brokerage account. K.C. Irving appears to have understood that distinction with unusual clarity. In 1971, with a new inheritance tax about to take effect in New Brunswick, he abruptly relocated his legal residence to Bermuda, moving control of his companies into a new layer of offshore holding structures, and never publicly said why. Decades later, in 2017, his son, J.K. Irving, finally explained it plainly. The tax rate under consideration could have reached 80% of the company's value. In his own words, it would have been devastating, forcing the family to sell off the operating businesses themselves just to cover what the government would have been owed at his father's death. That single decision set off a chain reaction that stayed hidden for nearly half a century. In 1976, K.C. Irving created 2 trusts in Bermuda, one for his children and one for his grandchildren, and a third followed through his will when he died in 1992. Those trusts worked exactly as intended for decades, until Canadian tax law changed again, threatening to make offshore trusts like these fully taxable starting at the end of 2013. Between 2009 and 2013, all 3 branches of the family raced quietly to dissolve the old trusts, consolidate everything into a single new structure, and divide it among themselves before the deadline arrived. None of it became public until 2017 through the leaked Paradise Papers. Here is the part that actually matters, beyond the intrigue of offshore paperwork. When that 2013 deadline was closing in, the real risk to the family was never simply losing money on a balance sheet. It was the possibility of having to liquidate real, physical, operating businesses, sawmills, a working refinery, an entire fleet of trucks, standing forest, just to raise cash fast enough to satisfy a tax bill. A portfolio of stocks can be sold in seconds, often at a terrible price, the instant a family needs money on a deadline. A forest, a mill, a working port cannot be dumped that quickly, and more importantly, it doesn't need to be. It keeps generating real cash on its own, harvest after harvest, cargo after cargo, giving the people who own it time to negotiate on their own terms, instead of being forced into a fire sale by someone else's calendar. Today, Irving Limited alone owns more than 3 million acres of forest across Canada, and on top of that, the family holds the largest privately owned stretch of land in the entire state of Maine, well over 1 million more acres just south of the border. Combined with Irving Oil and the family's other holdings, the Irvings are worth an estimated $14 billion, the second richest family in Canada, controlling, by some estimates, upward of 200 separate companies, though even that number is a guess, because a family this determined to stay private has never once confirmed the real total. By 1890, James Buchanan Duke controlled 40% of the entire American cigarette market, using a newly automated rolling machine most of his competitors hadn't adopted yet. That same year, he merged his company with 4 rivals to form the American Tobacco Company, which would eventually control more than 90% of cigarette sales in the United States. It was, by any definition, a monopoly, and it behaved like one. Perfected nowhere was that more visible than in a stretch of Kentucky and Tennessee known as the Black Patch. Between 1904 and 1909, Duke's company pushed the price paid to tobacco farmers so low that many of them lost their land outright. When the farmers organized and Duke refused to negotiate, the response turned violent. Masked riders, sometimes in groups of more than 100, burned barns and warehouses, dynamited processing equipment, and, in at least one case, rode into the town of Princeton, Kentucky, and took it over by force. This isn't a rumor passed down through family stories. It's documented regional history, and it happened directly because of pricing decisions made at the top of Duke's company. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ordered the American Tobacco Company broken apart into 16 separate companies for violating federal antitrust law. It was the public collapse of the empire Duke had spent 2 decades building, and for a while, his name carried exactly the reputation you'd expect: a robber baron, a monopolist, a man who had crushed farmers to protect his margins. What happened next is the part almost nobody connects to what came before. Duke had been in quiet contact for years with William Preston Few, the president of a small Methodist college in North Carolina called Trinity College. It was Few, not Duke, who first proposed turning that small college into something far larger. In 1916, Duke said publicly that he intended to give away a substantial part of his fortune while he was still alive. In 1919, Few formally proposed a foundation tied to the college, and on December 11, 1924, Duke signed an indenture of trust, committing $40 million to a permanent perpetual fund, on the condition that Trinity College be renamed, not after himself, but after his family, and specifically after his father and his brother, who had quietly funded Methodist causes for decades before James ever got involved. Trinity College became Duke University. James Buchanan Duke died less than a year later, in 1925. The indenture didn't just create a university. It set exact percentages, written down permanently: 46% to higher education, 32% to nonprofit hospitals across the Carolinas, 12% to rural Methodist churches, 10% to child welfare. A century later, those percentages still largely hold. The trustees of the Duke Endowment still meet 10 times a year, exactly as the document specified, and once a year, they read the entire original indenture aloud from beginning to end, a ritual observance of a dead man's exact instructions, generation after generation of trustees who never once met him. This mechanism hasn't slowed down since. In December 2024, exactly 100 years after the indenture was signed, the Duke Endowment committed at least $1.9 billion to 4 different colleges to be distributed over the following 15 years. Proof that a document written by a dead man in 1924 is still actively deciding where enormous sums of money go, a full century later, without needing a single living Duke to approve it. Whether Duke consciously built that foundation to repair the reputation the antitrust case had cost him is something no surviving document actually confirms. What he said publicly was closer to religious duty than public relations, that he owed everything he'd built to his father and to his church. But the timing tells its own quiet story regardless of motive. A monopoly dismantled by the Supreme Court in 1911, and a permanent, self-perpetuating legacy formally sealed just 13 years later. Today, the Duke Endowment alone holds more than $5 billion in assets, still giving away hundreds of millions of dollars a year, a century after the man who built it, and the reputation he built it partly to survive, had passed entirely out of memory. In 1759, a brewer named Arthur Guinness signed a lease on a rundown property at St. James's Gate in Dublin. The terms were unusual even for the time: £100 up front, £45 a year, for 9,000 years. That lease is, technically, still valid today. It won't expire until the year 10,759. The real turning point for the family's long-term fortune wasn't a business decision at all. It was a marriage. In 1873, Edward Cecil Guinness, from the brewing side of the family, married his own third cousin, Adelaide Guinness, from the family's banking side. The marriage quietly reunited two branches of the same bloodline, concentrating ownership and financial control inside the family before the company ever sold a single share to outside investors. When Edward died in 1927, his estate was valued at roughly £13 million, a British inheritance record at the time. Over the following decades, the family repeated a version of that same pattern, but in the opposite direction, marrying outward into British aristocracy. Guinness daughters and granddaughters became baronesses, marrying into titled families with names like Plunkett and Oranmore and Brown. Wealth converted into status, status converted into access, access converted into a social and political network money alone couldn't buy. For a while, it worked exactly as intended. 1920s, three of those daughters, Eileen, Maureen, and Una Guinness, sisters known across London society as the Golden Guinness Girls, became genuine celebrities in their own right, famous simply for being visible, wealthy, and photographed at exactly the right parties. It was the aristocratic marriage strategy working exactly as designed. One generation in, money converted into fame, fame converted into further access. Una herself went on to marry the fourth Baron Oranmore and Brown in 1936. Then, in the years that followed, that same exposure started producing very different headlines. In 1944, Walter Guinness, by then a British government minister serving in the Middle East, was assassinated in Cairo. In 1966, Tara Brown, the son of one of those aristocratic Guinness marriages, a fixture of London's most fashionable social circles and a close friend of the Beatles, died in a car accident in London at 21 years old. His death became famous well beyond the family itself. John Lennon read the newspaper account of it and used it as the opening image of A Day in the Life. Decades later, in 1986, the company itself became the center of a criminal fraud case when its own executives illegally manipulated Guinness stock during a corporate takeover battle, a scandal that eventually sent the chief executive to prison. The time all of this had accumulated in the press, the phrase "the Guinness curse" had entered popular culture, the idea that the family was somehow marked by fate. It's a compelling story, and it isn't true, at least not in any way the family itself accepts. A Guinness family spokesperson eventually addressed it directly and plainly. Any large family, over enough generations, will have its share of grief. Every tragedy attached to the family name is real and independently documented. What isn't documented, anywhere, is a curse connecting them. Actually connects them is simpler and less mystical. The same strategy that consolidated the family's control and multiplied its wealth in 1873 also placed later generations directly in the public eye, generation after generation, with all of the exposure, scrutiny, and risk that comes with it. The marriage that built the fortune and the marriage that produced Tara Brown were two branches of the exact same family logic. One protected the money. The other, decades later, put an heir's entire life in a spotlight he never asked for. In 1997, what remained of the original brewing company merged with Grand Metropolitan in a deal worth roughly £12 billion, close to $19 billion, forming the company known today as Diageo, the final chapter of a business empire that began with a 9,000-year lease and a marriage between cousins. In 1941, a 14-year-old named Bill Marriott Jr. started working for his father's company. His first job wasn't in an office. It was stapling invoices in the accounting department of a small chain of root beer stands his father, J. Willard Marriott, had built from a single stall in Washington, D.C. Soon after, he moved into the restaurants themselves, washing pots, making sundaes and milkshakes, eventually working the fry station, washing dishes, and cooking hamburgers on the line. He didn't become a full supervisor of the company's very first hotel not long after. He was elected to the board and made executive vice president in January of 1964, became company president that November at 32 years old, when the entire company still consisted of just 45 restaurants and 4 hotels, and didn't become chief executive until 1972, or chairman of the board until 1985, the year his father died. From his first stapled invoice in 1941 to becoming chief executive in 1972, 31 years passed, and he didn't take over as chairman of the entire company until 1985. It wasn't just talk about paying dues. His own father spent roughly half to 3/4 of every working day physically inside the restaurants themselves, not behind a desk, and Bill Jr. carried that habit forward for the rest of his career. By the 1980s, when the company operated hundreds of hotels, he was still spending around 180 days a year on the road, flying roughly 150,000 miles annually just to walk hotel floors and talk to staff in person. And the pattern repeated almost exactly in the next generation. David Marriott, Bill Jr.'s son and the company's current chairman, started his own Marriott career as a dishwasher at 15, then spent 26 years working through food service, housekeeping, and the front desk before ever reaching the boardroom. But the family's real test of this system wasn't Bill Jr., and it wasn't David. It was a son who did everything the family playbook required, and it still wasn't enough. John Marriott III, Bill Jr.'s son, spent years climbing the same operational ladder his father and grandfather had climbed before him. By around 2005, according to court filings and later reporting, Bill Marriott had quietly begun looking elsewhere for his eventual successor. A former company executive later described the problem bluntly. John had done everything required of him on his way up, but in front of media at a hotel opening or working a room at a cocktail reception, he never seemed comfortable in the way the role now demanded. In 2011 and 2012, Bill Marriott handed control of the company not to his son, but to Arne Sorensen, a former litigation attorney with no blood connection to the family at all, the first chief executive in the company's history without the Marriott name. Years later, in 2017, John Marriott III sued his own father and his uncle, alleging he had been pushed out of the family business after his divorce, which his parents had opposed. A family spokesperson denied the claims. The case was settled quietly the following year on undisclosed terms. Time J. Willard Marriott Sr. died in 1985. The company he'd built from a single root beer stand employed 140,000 people across 26 countries, operating 1,400 restaurants and 143 hotels, with $3.5 billion in annual sales. Today, under decades of that same hands-on succession model, Marriott International operates roughly 8,000 properties across 30 brands in 139 countries and territories. Bill Marriott Jr. himself still personally held just over 12% of the company as of the end of 2025, a stake worth close to $10 billion, proof that staying operationally close to the business for 60 years didn't just protect the family's role in it, it multiplied what there was to protect. The lesson sitting underneath that lawsuit is uncomfortable, and it's exactly why the story matters here. Decades of hands-on operational training, dishwashing and all, turned out to be necessary, but never sufficient on their own. The Marriott family didn't treat succession as something owed to blood. They treated it as a job that had to be earned fresh, by whoever was actually best suited to do it, even when that meant choosing a stranger over a son who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly that moment. In 1898, a young newspaperman named James M. Cox bought the Dayton Evening News for $26,000. He would go on to serve 2 terms as governor of Ohio and run for president in 1920, losing badly, with a young Franklin Roosevelt as his running mate. The newspaper he bought as a young man eventually grew into Cox Enterprises, a media, cable, and automotive conglomerate that today earns more than $20 billion a year, and has, for almost its entire history, refused to let outside investors own any meaningful piece of it. That refusal wasn't automatic, and it wasn't free. In 1964, part of the company, Cox Broadcasting, actually went public on the New York Stock Exchange, with the family retaining majority control but allowing outside shareholders in for the first time. By 1985, the family had changed its mind, spending $1.3 billion to buy back every outstanding share and take the company fully private again. In 1995, a merger created a new publicly traded version of the cable business, and in 2004, the family decided, for a second time, to take it all back private, a decision that didn't go quietly. Minority shareholders sued, arguing the family's buyout offer undervalued the company. An independent special committee negotiated the price up from $32 a share to $34.75, conditioned on approval from a majority of the minority shareholders themselves, not just the family. The deal closed in December 2004 at $8.4 billion, financed by Citigroup and Lehman Brothers. The case that resulted, decided in a Delaware court, went on to establish a legal standard still cited today in disputes over controlling shareholders buying out the public, a piece of case law now taught in business school classrooms, born entirely from one family's insistence on staying private. The family's own reasoning has been stated plainly, on the record. James Kennedy, the company's chairman emeritus and a great-grandson of the founder's line, once put it this way: the family had purposely kept, in his words, a very guarded shell around itself, and believed it had served them well. Create noise, he said, and it becomes a good time for people to take shots at you. That philosophy was tested again recently. In 2025, Cox Communications agreed to combine with Charter Communications in a deal worth roughly $34.5 billion, finally approved by federal regulators in early 2026. But even in an exit this size, the family structured the deal to avoid simply cashing out entirely, taking a mix of preferred and common units in the combined company instead of pure cash, leaving them holding close to a quarter of the merged business, rather than walking away with nothing but a check. Turbulence inside the family today runs through a Cox family voting trust and a set of internal trusts so private that even a great-grandson of the founder, James Cox Chambers, has said publicly he was never entirely sure what he was worth, because the structure managing it was kept so deliberately opaque. The two vehicles at the center of that opacity have names of their own: the Dayton Trust and the Atlanta Trust, both created directly by James M. Cox himself, decades ago, and still the backbone of how the family's wealth is held today. When a public dispute broke out in Atlanta in 2023 and 2024 over a controversial police training facility on land tied to Cox family interests, reporting on the controversy was what finally pulled back the curtain on just how secretive those trusts still are, even to some members of the family itself. There has never been a formal written rule discovered anywhere stating the Cox family will never sell. What exists instead is nearly 130 years of behavior pointing in exactly that direction. A family that went public twice, went private twice, fought a legal battle in Delaware to protect the second decision, and even in its largest exit in company history, quietly arranged to keep a meaningful piece of what it built. Look back at everything you just walked through, and one thing becomes impossible to ignore. None of these 6 families survive because they were smarter, luckier, or more careful than everyone else who eventually lost it all. Every family that has ever gone broke controlled real money at some point too. What actually separated these 6 wasn't the size of the fortune. It was whether, at some specific moment, someone inside the family built a structure sturdier than any single person's judgment on any single day could ever be. The Cargills and Macmillans didn't stay wealthy because every heir happened to be responsible. They stayed wealthy because a set of bylaws, written decades ago, made it structurally impossible for any one branch or any one bad decision to break the company apart. The Irvings didn't protect themselves with cleverness alone. They protected themselves by owning something a tax bill or a market crash couldn't force them to dump overnight. The Dukes didn't outrun their own reputation by hoping people would forget. They built a document, still read aloud every single year, that quietly keeps doing the work long after the man who signed it stopped being able to explain himself. The Guinnesses learned, sometimes at real human cost, that the same mechanism which builds a fortune can also expose it. The Marriotts discovered that even decades of preparation aren't automatically owed a seat at the top, and the Coxes proved, twice, that staying private is never passive. It's a decision made again and again, sometimes in a courtroom, whenever the easier path would have been to simply cash out. You don't need a family office in Minnesota, 3 million acres of forest, or a trust fund in Bermuda for any of tonight's lesson to actually apply to you. The mechanism is identical at any size of fortune, however modest. Ask yourself honestly, if something happened to you next year, does everything you've built depend entirely on you personally making every decision correctly, forever, without a single mistake? Or is there actually something in place, a will that's current, a clear conversation already had with the people who will inherit what you've built, even one document that says plainly what happens next, that would hold up whether or not you personally were still the one holding it together? None of the 6 mechanisms you just watched were expensive to start either, relative to the size of the fortune they ended up protecting. A set of bylaws costs nothing but the discomfort of writing them. A conversation about what happens next costs nothing but the discomfort of having it. The families who built lasting structures didn't necessarily have more money to work with than the families who didn't. They simply treated the second question, what happens to this after me, as part of the actual work, instead of something to get around to eventually, once things settled down. Things rarely settle down in time. The instinct, once you have something worth protecting, is to keep total personal control over every part of it. It feels responsible. It feels like ownership is supposed to feel. But total, unstructured control was exactly what every family that lost everything in tonight's video also had, right up until the moment it quietly came apart. Real staying power tends to look like the opposite of that instinct, giving up a small amount of control now, on your own terms, in exchange for something that doesn't depend on you or your children or your children's children getting every single decision right forever. That isn't really a sacrifice, it's the actual definition of a legacy, something built to survive you on purpose rather than by accident or not at all. None of the 6 families tonight knew in advance exactly how their story would end. What separated the ones still standing wasn't certainty. It was a decision, made once, by someone whose name you may never learn, that the thing being built mattered more than any single person's total control over it, including their own. 6 families. 6 mechanisms tested by real crises nobody could have scripted in advance. A debt crisis in 1909, a tax deadline in 1971, a monopoly dismantled by the Supreme Court, a marriage that built a fortune and another that exposed one, a son who did everything right and still wasn't chosen, and a boardroom decision made twice, decades apart, to stay exactly as private as the family had always intended. Think back over what you actually just watched. A grain trading company that survived its founder's death only because of a marriage, then decades later wrote its own bylaws to make sure no single branch of the family could ever again hold the whole business hostage. A Canadian family, so committed to owning physical land instead of paper assets, that when a tax deadline finally came for their offshore trusts, they had the time and the cash flow to restructure calmly on their own terms, while the rest of the world found out only years later through a leaked set of documents. A tobacco fortune, built through a monopoly violent enough to burn down barns and take over an entire town by force, that transformed itself into a university and a 100-year-old charitable trust still read aloud, word for word, at every single annual meeting. A brewing dynasty that married its own cousins to keep control of the business, then married into the aristocracy to gain status, and watched that same exposure eventually produce an assassination, a world-famous death commemorated in a Beatles song, and a stock fraud scandal, decades apart from one another. A hotel empire that trained 3 generations of its own heirs from the dish pit upward, and then, when one of those heirs still didn't fit the role after decades of preparation, chose a stranger over blood without hesitation. And a media company that went public twice and dragged itself back to full private ownership twice, fighting a real legal battle in Delaware both times, simply because staying private was always the entire point. Notice what tonight's 6 stories were never actually about. Not one of them hinged on picking the right stock, timing a market perfectly, or discovering some secret investment nobody else knew about. Getting rich, it turns out, is the easy part of this entire story, comparatively speaking. A single generation, a single decision, a single moment of timing or talent can do it. Staying rich, across 100 years, across heirs you'll never meet, making decisions long after you're gone, requires something else entirely. A structure built to keep working without you. Unless these 6 families needed to be exceptional people to pull that off. They needed to be willing, at some specific moment, to build something more disciplined than their own good intentions, because good intentions, on their own, have never once been enough to survive 100 years. That's really the quiet thread running underneath every one of tonight's families. Whether they were building a boardroom rule, a piece of forest, a university endowment, a marriage, 3 decades of dishwashing, or a private holding company that twice walked away from Wall Street on purpose. The size of the fortune was never really the point. It never is. The point was always whether someone, at some specific moment nobody else was watching closely, decided the thing they built mattered more than their own control over it. If tonight's video is the kind of thing that actually interests you, not how to get rich quickly, because that was never on offer here and never will be, but how real wealth is deliberately engineered to survive the very people who built it, subscribe, because we go this deep into exactly these families and exactly these mechanisms every single week. Going somewhere almost nobody thinks to look. The quiet, unglamorous sports the ultra-rich actually choose to play behind closed doors, away from cameras entirely, and why the sport itself was never really the point of playing it at all. Bless you.